there is a fifth dimension, beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition, and it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is the dimension of imagination. It is an area which we call the Twilight Zone.
What exactly was the Twilight Zone? That voice we heard was the voice of Rod Serling, the creator, writer, host, and narrator of the show that 50 years ago tonight at 10 p.m. debuted on the CBS television network. Rod Serling, most people seem to know the name The Twilight Zone. In fact, the U.S. Post Office just delivered this year, in the spring, finally a stamp. It was part of an entire collection of what they call the early TV memories. You could see Rod down there in the bottom row. But nevertheless, he gets his stamp. He's been in the New York Times. Here we are in the Times Center. Once you've made it in the crossword puzzle, you've seen headlines like this, where the Twilight Zone becomes a part of the American vernacular. You kind of know what this means. When Jim Hoberman wrote this in The Village Voice, that some movie unfurls like a long, sensuous episode of the Twilight Zone, what does that really mean 50 years later when we're talking about the original Twilight Zone? You've seen things like this, the Comedy Zone. You've seen takeoffs, you've seen knockoffs. We've all heard Serling vocal impressions. We've seen images like this. We've seen magazine articles with the actual name. But of course, this is not about the Twilight Zone, the TV show. It's about the latest rage, the vampire craze of Twilight. You think that name came out of nowhere? Leonardo DiCaprio, I don't know if everybody knows, just signed a screenwriter to do a full-length Twilight Zone movie. Probably will come out next year or the year after. Why would he? What is it about the Twilight Zone 50 years later that we're here tonight to celebrate? Look right around you. Tonight, right in Times Square, this movie's opening. Surrogates. What's it about? Just like the recent Sarah Connor Chronicles and the whole Terminator thing, it's about people as robots who want to become human. The very first Twilight Zone to be filmed after the pilot that we'll watch at 10 o'clock tonight, the exact 50th anniversary, but after the pilot was sold, the very first episode to be filmed was with Jean Marsh as a robot woman. And the idea in the 60s with the most epic science fiction film, 2001, A Space Odyssey, how the robot that could think, the robot that could fight for itself, for its life. But yet the Twilight Zone, like everything we're going to see tonight, like everything in American popular culture, did it first, albeit in early 60s vernacular. Nevertheless, it was the computer that could love, just like the computer in HAL could kill. And in fact, the penultimate scene that shocked everybody when they first saw it to this day, the mixture of the outer space futuristic with the Baroque, was of course first done on the Twilight Zone in 1961 in the episode The Invaders, the juxtaposition of the futuristic with the old-fashioned American vernacular. A cousin to the female robot, of course, is directly in Blade Runner with the replicant played by Dara Hannah. The whole movie, like so many examples of great science fiction, is about replicants, robots, mannequins wanting to become human. In fact, that was such a theme of the Twilight Zone, a sub-theme, mannequins becoming real. In fact, Metropolis magazine in the 90s had a special issue where it said, our continued fascination with mannequins goes back to these very first Twilight Zone episodes. In fact, Anne Francis, who was cast, looked like a human Barbie doll. Also, 50 years ago this year, 1959, was brought to America. Coincidence or Twilight Zone coincidence? That both would debut, and so many episodes were about these inanimate objects becoming animate. Now, one of the sub-themes of this evening will be that you'll see so many actors and actresses who later went on to sometimes cult stardom. She was a female James Bond. But at the end of the episode, when she's revealed to be a mannequin, you'll also see the Twilight Zone's influence in a great American photographer, Diane Arbus, who said about this image that she called it blonde girl with shiny lipstick. She wanted to see the real difference between things, between flesh and material. And another way you could see the Twilight Zone's impact on modern art is when you see Dwayne Hansen's sculptures, and somebody would say they have a Twilight Zone feel to them. What they're describing are these classic, unbelievable, half-hour anthology dramas, never before seen on television before and since. And you could see this idea of humans as dolls echoed in the work of George Siegel, New Jersey native artist right across the river in New Brunswick, home of Rutgers. Here's another thing called the toll booth. But in Siegel's work, when I was a kid, I did a paper in high school, and I quoted from the Twilight Zone, because when I looked at Siegel's work, I saw the episode The Dummy, which is the greatest dummy come to life episode of all, and we'll see them a little later. There was a kind of a macabre black humor aspect to the Twilight Zone, like in this episode, It's a Good Life, when this poor actor is turned into a jack-in-the-box that still had his bad face. Now, I always looked at this guy, and it looked a little Nixonian to me. You know, the wish fulfillment that never actually happened. But also, this aspect of the Twilight Zone, first of all, the black and white look, this is what was first recognized in David Lynch's debut film, Eraserhead. And when you see images like this, that have a black comedic aspect, the Twilight Zone was sort of the Lennon-McCartney flip side, is that an image like this, which has some of that, also has an Ozymandias feel, where it's got heavy philosophical meaning. And that's also what the Twilight Zone was about. And how did it affect television immediately? Most people, they talk about shows like The Outer Limits that came after the Twilight Zone. And my feeling is those are hour-long shows that were padded. You edit them down to a half hour, like the Twilight Zone, where they would be perfect. The biggest influence the Twilight Zone had in television very soon after it went off the air in 1964 was, of course, Star Trek. The very first episode of Star Trek was written by George Clayton Johnson, who, if anybody heard me today on WNYC, I had a little radio interview, and Clayton Johnson called in. You should see what he looks like now after the 1960s, if you know what I mean. He looks like the ancient one from Doctor Strange. But anyway, he wrote the debut episode. And of course, once again, we see Robert Redford, actors who later became famous. But in Star Trek, of course, we first saw William Shatner in these Twilight Zone episodes. And later, when he did famous Star Trek episodes like The Enemy Within, where Kirk splits in two, the evil Kirk, yet the more masculine Kirk, the more confident Kirk, written by Richard Matheson, second writer of most Twilight Zone episodes after Serling. The whole Star Trek cast was, of course, on the Twilight Zone first. Leonard Nimoy was just a bit actor in an episode called The Quality of Mercy. George Takei, of course, was on a Twilight Zone episode, Little Seen, because he was taken out of syndication, thinking in the 60s it would cause bad racial stereotypes. Meanwhile, a couple years later, there's Sulu on the famous Star Trek episode that everybody knows and loves. But on a more serious note, Roddenberry delivered the eulogy at Serling's funeral and basically said that where would Star Trek be? It would only be a glimmer in my eye if not for what Serling did with the Twilight Zone. Even after the Twilight Zone, when Serling tried in 1969 with Night Gallery, what's significant about this show, because Serling didn't have the same creative control, is that a young television director named Steven Spielberg directed the debut episode with Joan Crawford. And it got a lot of acclaim because Spielberg was directing Mod Squad episodes for Aaron Spelling. So what was his next gig after Night Gallery? He does a TV movie called Duel. What's Duel about? Well, first of all, it stars Dennis Weaver, who was a veteran of one of the most classic Twilight Zone episodes, Shadow Play. Those of you might remember Dennis Weaver once again. In 1970, after the Twilight Zone became an icon with McCloud. Now, Duel was written by Richard Matheson. It's about a truck whose driver you never see, chasing Dennis Weaver. And producers of a little indie film that was released in '75 looked at this and said, you know, if a guy named Steven Spielberg can make a mechanical truck so menacing, almost supernatural, what could he do with a mechanical shark? Not exactly an indie film from '75. But the mayor in Jaws, where did you see him? Murray Hamilton. Those of you remember him as the husband in The Graduate. But he was Mr. Death in like the second Twilight Zone episode to be aired. Now, Spielberg's buddy, George Lucas, what would you say is the Twilight Zone influence on such a machine like Star Wars? Well, before Star Wars, what was his film? American Graffiti, one of the greatest films of the 1970s. But what was Lucas's first film? It was a science fiction film, THX 1138. What was it about? Classic dystopian universe shot in the void. Enemies of the state. It was half Orwell, half Serling. Starring Robert Duvall. 1970, pre-Godfather, little-known actor. But on Twilight Zone, in an episode, one of the 1 hours, I don't like him. That's a whole other story. But, called Miniature. Now, the actors on the Twilight Zone, very few of them had backgrounds before the Twilight Zone. Yes, Mickey Rooney was in an episode. Yes, he had worked with Serling during the 50s and the golden age of live TV. He was the biggest box office #1 in 1940 and 39, I think. Even further back, Buster Keaton, the legendary Buster Keaton, was on a Twilight Zone episode. But mostly what the Twilight Zone was about was taking actors like Lee Marvin in 1961, unknown, before Who Shot Liberty Valance. Most people know him as the general in the archetypal Dirty Dozen. James Coburn. Who else? The first movie is actually worthy of the Connery Bonds, Our Man Flint. Do I have to say his name? Yes. Yes. Charles Bronson, Death Wish. Every one of these very masculine archetypes of a certain era that came of age in the early 60s and later graduated. I mean, nowadays everybody knows him as Uncle Ben. But Cliff Robertson, great actor. Of course, Dennis Hopper. Where did he start on Twilight Zone? A Nazi Bundenleader in 1963. Gee, what a stretch. Not a big surprise when years later he really came back in David Lynch's Blue Velvet. Now his co-star, Dean Stockwell, also in the Twilight Zone, in a great episode that I talked about before, Quality of Mercy, in which he actually transforms into a Japanese soldier to see what life would be like from the other side. We have met the enemy and it is us. Serling wrote that episode based on his experience in the Philippines. 2 episodes of the Twilight Zone were based there. That's where Serling, like an entire generation, saw death and came back to either not talk about it or talk about it through their creative work. Now, in addition to heavy drama, there was also the lighter episodes of the Twilight Zone. Now, once again, very few of the actors had histories before the Twilight Zone. Art Carney was in one of the 6 videotaped episodes where he plays a Santa Claus down on his luck that, of course, becomes the real Santa Claus in true Twilight Zone juxtaposition. Once again, mostly about young actors that later became comedy legends. Jack Klugman. Even women. Serling wrote so many episodes for women and about women that I'm going to show you in little bits and pieces tonight that became icons in their own right. Once again, with the women, there were very few that had histories before. Agnes Moorehead was Citizen Kane's mother. But what do most of us know her from? Endora on Bewitched. In fact, the entire cast of Bewitched was on the Twilight Zone. Elizabeth Montgomery was the first episode of the 3rd season, co-starring with Charles Bronson. The first the first Darren Stevens, Dick York, he was in that other Philippines episode called The Purple Testament, in which a man can see the glow of death on men's faces. That's Serling channeling the death he saw in the Philippines. Every story you've heard of about the buddy in the foxhole next to you that gets blown to bits. Serling channels it into episodes like this. George Clayton Johnson, he's in another episode, Dick York, A Penny for Your Thoughts, in which you can read people's minds. But of course, Billy Mooney in this episode, always immortal and lost in space. In fact, even Dr. Smith was in an episode of The Twilight Zone. Martin Landau, Mission Impossible. Peter Falk, of course, now we're into the 70s, Columbo. After Night Gallery, there was a very short-lived series in 1972 called, interestingly enough, The Sixth Sense, that had Stephen Collins at its host. It was on ABC. It ran for, I don't know, maybe 12 episodes and was taken off the air. Then, of course, we get into the 80s, Tales from the Dark Side. George Romero, Night of the Living Dead, tries his hand at a Serling knockoff. 83 was also the ignominious debut of Steven Spielberg's, in my feelings, just every one of these modern Twilight Zones gets the point wrong. They film it in color, first of all. The Twilight Zone was the middle ground between light and shadow. It's a black and white show. Even Spielberg did his own Amazing Stories in '85 when they tried to revive the Twilight Zone. The best example of the Twilight Zone's influence is, of course, The X-Files, and Chris Carter, in interview after interview, has talked about its influence. J.J. Abrams, Lost. Well, let's see. Serling had a short-lived series, 1969, called The New People, about an airplane crash on a deserted island with a band of young people that attempt to set up a society. Lost. His new thing, Fringe, I mean, it's basically X-Files mixed with the Twilight Zone. So what was the Twilight Zone? Oh, here's another example. The second episode was last night. What is Flash Forward about? Everybody gets a glimpse of their future. Well, let's see. Twilight Zone. A most unusual camera. About a camera that takes pictures slightly in the future. Later on in the series, What's in the Box? Uncle Charlie from My Three Sons gets to see his future, but about a couple minutes flash forwarding, where he actually beats his wife and punches her out the window. This is 1964, when every domestic household was Ozzie and Harriet. This was what was in the box in Twilight Zone. So that's what Flash Forward is. They're not remakes, they're not rip-offs, but they're inspired creatively. Every single thing that's in science fiction, fantasy, horror, we can trace back to Twilight Zone in less than 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. Most people think of the Twilight Zone as a science fiction TV series. And of course, some of its greatest episodes were written by science fiction masters like Richard Matheson, who of course wrote the upteenth film version of his famous I Am Legend novel. That's the model for all of the zombie vampire movies against the remaining humans model. Charles Beaumont wrote the episodes that are more considered the horror episodes of the Twilight Zone. And it's true, there were horror elements of the Twilight Zone. Its surprise endings are among the most horror, nightmare-inducing. If you saw these images as a child, they're burned into your brain forever. Sometimes the Twilight Zone had the cliche images you would expect with horror. There was never a vampire episode. There was a devil episode. In fact, Richard Donner, the creator of one of the great modern horror movies, the original Omen, got his start directing the more horror elements of the Twilight Zone, like the famous Shatner episode with the gremlin on the wing. Stephen King, the modern master of horror, like Spielberg, is one of Serling's children. He talks about in his nonfiction book, Dance Macabre. He devotes a whole chapter that he calls The Glass Tit to the Twilight Zone. You look at King's work, I mean, come on, Christine. There was a car episode, You Drive. There was even an early one that's more like Christine, called A Thing About Machines. And it's this car model that the designer of this great movie in 1978, with the very early Mr. Barbra Streisand, James Brolin, fighting against this devilish car, which you can see had that Twilight Zone feeling to it. Some people think the Twilight Zone was a fantasy show. Well, it was set in a reality that, like David Lynch's films, looked under the dark underbelly of suburbia, and yet more real and true for its day and ours. Because Serling, in September '63, has Jack Klugman saying to the audience, "My son is dying in a place called South Vietnam. There isn't even supposed to be a war going on there." The very first mention of Vietnam in a fictional context on American television. So once again, what was the Twilight Zone about? Well, the very first newspaper ad for the very first episode that was published today, Friday, October 2nd, 1959. First of all, when did you ever see the writer, creator of a show as the illustrated image? But read it. It's defined by the author. The author. The author. The land that lies between science and superstition, between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. You will find the bizarre but the believable, the different, the shocking, that it's yet understandable. Well, that's pretty much a definition of great science fiction literature, which, of course, Twilight Zone was rich and deep in. But here's the key line that makes it postmodern, that basically is saying to the audience, this is not literature, this is not even radio. Its tales must be shown. They cannot be told. That's basically saying, get ready for half-hour television as art, because that is what the Twilight Zone became. And here's the last little tag, and each carries with it its own special surprise. But when you basically read that, Serling's laying out the Twilight Zone no different than the creator of surrealism, André Breton, a French poet, in the 1920s came up with, and he wrote a manifesto. That's what those guys did while they were meeting in cafes and smoking cigarettes. They wrote manifestos. And when you read the manifesto by Breton describing surrealism, he says, let me get my notes. He talks about the definition of surrealism as being that there exists a spot in the mind, and I'm going to show Twilight Zone images that back it up. There exists a spot in the mind between which life and death, the real and the imaginary, the past and the future, the high and the low, the communicable and the incommunicable will cease to appear contradictory. And that is basically surrealism, and that's no different than what Serling was laying out in his manifesto. In fact, one of Breton's other descriptions of surrealism was illustrated by Man Ray, the great surrealist photographer, as beautiful as the unexpected meeting on a dissection table between an umbrella and a sewing machine. In other words, the juxtaposition of two different realities that never got mixed together. Kind of like finding a spaceship on your roof or a lion in your bedroom. A lion in your bedroom. Magritte painted many paintings for some reason with lions in very suburban settings. And that's what the Twilight Zone was. And yet, in addition to being influenced subconsciously or unconsciously by surrealism, it also influenced American artists and pop culture. This is Chris Van Allsburg's illustration from Jumanji, which was made into a movie. That, of course, you see. When you see an image like this, from What You Need, you see its antecedent in surrealism. But yet, a Twilight Zone image like this also influenced the American artist Cindy Sherman, who takes self-portraits and puts herself, like that image, in the picture. Here's another Twilight Zone image, and here's Cindy Sherman's work from the mid-'80s. So when an image like this is on the Twilight Zone, yes, it has a forerunner in the many doors that Magritte painted that are synonymous when you think of surrealist imagery. And yet the Twilight Zone door, appearing in the early 60s, that was basically a what-if show saying, what if the universe was different? What if there wasn't racism? What if there wasn't prejudice? All the big themes, the philosophies of life. It opened up the door before psychedelic imagery and ideas opened up in the late 60s. So the Twilight Zone is that middle ground between surrealism and psychedelia. And the opening graphics of the Twilight Zone kind of were icons in and of themselves and somewhat foreshadowed the interior photography of the show itself. In fact, let's take a look at the very first graphic opening of the Twilight Zone in 1959.
There is a fifth dimension, beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition, and it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is the dimension of imagination. It is an area which we call the Twilight Zone.
Well, the very first image we see is this gauze parting. And you see a Man Ray image like this that he called a hairnet, 1931. Man Ray said he was interested in what he called the enigma of things, a study of surfaces to expose their essentials. In fact, the look of the Twilight Zone functioned on two levels. On one level, as a kind of metaphor for the inner torment that these characters were going through between flesh and material, between reality and surreality. And yet it's also a metaphor for the phosphor dots of the image itself. And the Twilight Zone imagery, whenever you're flipping around the dial, you know when you've landed on Twilight Zone. These stark close-ups, the graphic chiaroscuro imagery, the tilted angles, that really were the art of the close-up on the Twilight Zone. And the set design placed actors in sparse, stylized situations that treated them like the props that they often, of course, turned out to be. After the gauze parts, we see clouds. The clouds come down to a kind of a lunar landscape, but yet, as Sam Kleberger, who's still alive, he's like an 80-year-old man in LA who teaches art now, I got in contact with him, and he said, Arlen, when I was doing these images, I wasn't trying to create places, I was trying to create places that hadn't been discovered yet. So even though the classic surrealist landscape, like Dali in the 30s, he did 1 million of these, it's not quite Dali. Here's a Magritte. Again, all of these surrealist landscapes, but the Twilight Zone carried them into this pseudo-lunar feel. Now, after the lunar feel, we get what Kleberger said. CBS didn't want science fiction because it wasn't going to be that. They didn't want something specific. They wanted things that would be a little more general because it wasn't going to be any of those, yet all of those. So they knew it back then. And Serling sent people literally down into the pit of man's fears, and we can see the influence on the graphics, on the interior photography. And images like this of man on a shattered landscape, both literally as well as figuratively, are like the surrealist landscape strewn with debris and laced with melancholy and, I mean, heavy with meaning. No different than Giorgio de Chirico's barren landscapes that also had time and once in a while a lone figure. This mixture of images like this, of man and the world. The very first Twilight Zone episode that we're going to see tonight at 10 o'clock, Where Is Everybody?, has these barren, stark landscapes, man alone, no different than de Chirico's. Enigma paintings, they were called, by the way. There's the one lone figure, just like Earl Holliman is the one lone figure in Where Is Everybody? But mostly, the landscapes of the Twilight Zone were average American landscapes. Because as Richard Matheson said, it was not the Twilight Zone of the French culture or the German culture. It was the Twilight Zone of the American culture. It was our Twilight Zone. You see an image like this, I think of the Talking Heads. You might find yourself behind the wheel of a large automobile. And there's a Twilight Zone aspect to those lines. Inger Stevens in a phone booth, beautifully chiaroscuro lit. This is what you would look like when you find out that you're dead, not alive. AKA The Sixth Sense. Done first on the Twilight Zone. The episode Mirror Image, in which a woman sees herself in a drab bus station. This is her duplicate. This is the mini masterpiece of the Twilight Zone. Look at that face. It's kind of like Mona Lisa. You don't know whether she's smiling, whether she's good, whether she's evil. To master that expression, to ride that line, is where the Twilight Zone traveled. Everything else falls on the wayside compared to the Twilight Zone. In that bus station, who she's unraveling to before our eyes is Martin Milner, who ends up seeing himself at the end. Martin Milner, one half of Adam 12 in 1968. Back to the bus station. This episode is kind of like an Edward Hopper painting come to life. In fact, the Automat, 1927. Zoom in closer, what do we get but Millicent Barnes from the Twilight Zone episode Mirror Image. In fact, Serling created a kind of psycho-American Gothic by holding a mirror up to American society, and this is what came back. The very first episode, Where Is Everybody?, echoed in Tom Cruise's film, Vanilla Sky, the very opening scene, has that Twilight Zone feel in that first season. Directed by Robert Stevens, whose only other episode of the Twilight Zone was the 5th episode, the greatest time travel episode of all time, Walking Distance. Why? When Gig Young, playing Serling's doppelganger, goes back in time to see himself as a child, meet his parents, the wish fulfillment of all of us when our parents die. He walks back in time through a mirror. Twilight Zone homage to the classic Through the Looking Glass. No modern special effect. The screen doesn't go Wayne's World on us. No, not in the Twilight Zone. In this episode, Gig Young, who committed suicide in 1971 after winning an Oscar for They Shoot Horses, Don't They? Photographed for posterity by George T. Clemens, the director of photography, ancestor of Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain. These are where close-ups are at their greatest in the Twilight Zone. The angles, and this was all Robert Stevens directed, but they are immortal. The carousel scene at the end, the tilted angles, the lighting, one of the most stylized scenes in a storied show like the Twilight Zone that had many scenes like this. It was the flip side of Hitchcock's Strangers on a Train carousel climax. It was the bittersweet, melancholy flip side to that, which is why Twilight Zone in this episode, every other time travel episode, lifts from Walking Distance. Back to the Future, Peggy Sue Gets Married, Big, 18 Again, you name it. But there will only be one Walking Distance to this day, the greatest single time travel episode of anything, film or television, perhaps even the greatest episode of the Twilight Zone, some might say. In that first season, again, strong roles for women. Ida Lupino, an actress who later directed an episode of the Twilight Zone. This is Serling's take on Sunset Boulevard, where you have an aging actress who remembers her glory days in silent films. And she actually, again, this is as most as Twilight Zone got, is a blurred image. She actually goes into the movie screen. Well, anybody remember Purple Rose of Cairo, 1985? Where Mia Farrow goes right into the screen. Once again, the foundation was laid by Twilight Zone. Richard Matheson's World of Difference. This is what the Twilight Zone was about. Everybody's experienced this. He goes into his office in the beginning of the episode, goes to make a phone call. The line's dead. He goes to ask his secretary what's going on with the phone. He hears somebody yell, "Cut." He turns around and his life is a movie. Hey man, isn't life like a movie? That was what everybody said in the 60s after psychedelic drugs hit. A movie in 1998 directed by Peter Weir, whose Australian films The Last Wave and Picnic at Hanging Rock are like Australian Down Under Twilight Zone episodes themselves, directed this movie, The Truman Show. What's it about? It's about a man who thinks his reality is his reality, but the people creating the reality are creating his reality. On the Twilight Zone episode that this was an inspiration of, to the film crew, he's an actor who's gone off the deep end, who believes he is the role he plays. From his point of view, his life has become a movie. Sound familiar? That's what The Matrix is basically based on. Mulholland Drive by David Lynch, his masterpiece, in my opinion, one of the greatest movies ever made, is basically taken from this idea of, is reality, do we live in a benevolent universe or a malevolent universe? In the first season, Third from the Sun, dealt with what became known as mutually assured destruction. And that is where Fritz Weaver, the great character actor on the left there, says, or in that episode, Edward Andros, who represents the military-industrial complex, says, 48 hours, talk is 48 hours, we'll have them all off. Then whoosh up over and whammo, there goes the enemy. And Fritz Weaver says, and what are they doing in the meantime? Well, probably striking back, but not with the same skill, not with the same accuracy. So Fritz Weaver says, oh, so then they lose 50 million people, we only lose 35. In fact, on the Twilight Zone in that first season, The episode Time Enough Laughs was the first fictionalized look at what would happen after the bomb drops on American television. 1959, the episode with Burgess Meredith that everybody remembers. In fact, that set design is still to this day one of the greatest television set designs in history. Black and white television on that budget. That is one of the greatest set designs. Now, Burgess Meredith, what did he become? Well, most people remember him from maybe a younger generation, of course, as Rocky's trainer. But, of course, he's the Penguin. In fact, practically the whole cast was on the Twilight Zone. Julie Newmar first played a devil woman. Once again, one of the 1-hour dismissible episodes. But here we go. David Wayne, the Mad Hatter, was on an episode called Escape Clause. You have Roddy McDowall as the bookworm. Roddy McDowall, well, he was on a very early episode called People Are Alike All Over. Roddy McDowall was Cornelius in Planet of the Apes. Planet of the Apes, maybe the greatest ending in modern movie history, ranks with the end of Citizen Kane. Most people don't know was created by Rod Serling. The book, the original book, Serling co-wrote the screenplay, that Tim Burton based his revival on a couple years ago, was where there's another planet where people are subservient to apes. Serling, in true Twilight Zone fashion, turned it around and brought it back to its Twilight Zone roots, where you realize at the end that you've been on Earth the whole time. Well, that's 1968. In 1960, Serling has an episode called I Shot an Arrow into the Air, in which 3 astronauts crash land on what they think is a desert planet. They kill each other off, 10 Little Indians style. One of the dying astronauts who went over the ridge to scout inscribes what looks like a cross in the sand. Well, the surviving astronaut goes over the ridge, and what does he see? Telephone poles. That's basically the Twilight Zone ending. In fact, the Planet of the Apes was injected with a racial component, in that there was a metaphor in 1968, at the height of the Black Panthers, at the height of the 60s, that it was as if the apes were the blacks in control. What would happen? That is what Serling got from the Twilight Zone. Why? In 1960, he cast a black man, Ivan Dixon, in a dramatic starring role. Ivan Dixon in Hogan's Heroes, years later. But Ivan Dixon as a black boxer who, in Twilight Zone juxtaposition, when he thinks he's the loser, becomes the winner. Only if he believes will he win. This was Serling's veiled pep talk to the civil rights movement, because 6 months later, the image of a smiling, proud African American, Cassius Clay, in the Summer Olympics, 6 months after that Twilight Zone episode was aired. Time Enough at Last, that image at the end, and the ending everybody remembers, in which he breaks his glasses. Very pessimistic for Serling's worldview. Well, that's because, like many of the greatest episodes, it was an adaptation. The art of the adaptation by Rod Serling. Many of his greatest episodes, maybe half of them, were brilliant adaptations of authors' works. That is one aspect, like a shining diamond, of the many-faceted genius elements of Rod Serling. One of the great episodes of the first season was Willoughby, in which, once again, a Serling doppelganger, James Daly, based on one of Serling's 50s teleplays, Patterns. Serling took the ideas that were in the 50s that he couldn't do anymore on live television and brought to the Twilight Zone in a tighter, half-hour, condensed version. So Patterns became Willoughby. That's where the push business. He couldn't take it. You might find yourself in a beautiful house with a beautiful wife and a beautiful child. You might ask yourself, how did I get here? Once in a Lifetime by the Talking Heads. That's what that episode is about. He discovers a respite in Willoughby, a 19th century haven that exists only in his mind. And those were Serling's images of Maple Street, USA. In fact, he lived in Westport, where I happen to live now, during the 50s before he did Twilight Zone. His ideas of Maple Street, in which your neighbors who all seem to love each other, when aliens just manipulate a few things, gee, how many movies have we seen of that? What happens? In a sense, when sun falls, this episode becomes a kind of a Night of the Living Dead, in which they literally, metaphorically, I mean, eat each other alive. And those images at the end of this episode, once again, the art of the graphic close-up. Serling said in 1955, I'm going to stay in TV because you're looking at people close up, both physically and psychologically. The Twilight Zone logo from the first season, Joe Messerly, who I uncovered out of nowhere living in Fairfield, Connecticut. Good old boy from down south, still with his alligator leather boots and his pompadour and his tight jeans. I said, Joe Messerly, you designed the Twilight Zone logo. I met him in 1991 when my book came out. Hand letter type. And he said, I've always gotten a comment that's slightly off. He said in the late 50s, when he was a young graphic designer working for CBS, he said there was a movement at the time for jumbo letters. We've all seen that Google architecture, late 50s, kind of goofy letters. This is done on a whole nother level. So now let's take a look at the second graphic open of the Twilight Zone that actually was only tagged on to a few episodes at the end of the first season. And why? Nobody knows.
You are about to enter another dimension, a dimension not only of sight and sound, but of mind, a journey into a wondrous land of imagination. Next stop, the Twilight Zone.
Now, the eye is one of the classic surrealist images. In fact, Man Ray, I was right. Close-up called Tears in 1930. The eye, you still see it in advertisements, always the close-up of the eye. Un Chien Andalou, one of the great surrealist movies, was all about that eye that gets slashed with the razor blade that most people can't even look at. But it's part of the surrealist literature. In Spellbound, Hitchcock's 47 film, he worked with Salvador Dali, and these were one of the paintings that Salvador Dali came up with, which later in the film ended up looking like this, which probably bears the most resemblance to the Twilight Zone eye. Now, the other classic surrealist eye is Magritte's False Mirror, which was actually the inspiration for William Golden to do the CBS logo, which Twilight Zone was a television show of. The other eye before the Twilight Zone was the graphic opening to Vertigo, designed by Saul Bass in 1958. The Twilight Zone opening came 2 years later in 1960. And then, of course, the pupil dissolves into an eye. And when I did my research into surrealism, I came up with Max Ernst's Moon Over the Sea lithograph, which has that kind of Twilight Zone feel and look to it. So the surrealist imagery of the Twilight Zone, ending with that logo, for some reason, only used for about 3 episodes, and then the beginning of the second season came this next video graphic opening to debut in fall of 1960, the second season of the Twilight Zone.
You're traveling through another dimension, a dimension not only of sight and sound, but of mind, a journey into a wondrous land of imagination. Next stop, the Twilight Zone.
Well, for some reason, the woman's eye was taken out, they brought back the gauze, and once again, this image is echoed in Man Ray's what he called rayographs, were the first photograms. Everybody that went to art school and took freshman year photography knows what photograms are, but Man Ray innovated them and he called them rayograms, and that's what this image most appears in surrealist lore. Now, what's remarkable about the second season of The Twilight Zone was that it debuted Rod Serling, the writer-creator, as the on-air host. Now, there had been on-air hosts before in television. In fact, one step beyond, a supernatural show that aired 1 year before The Twilight Zone, had a host, but there was only one Rod Serling. The delivery, the look, the style. That cigarette, by the way, that's what killed him, of course. But that whole kind of aura that makes Serling one of the greatest broadcast voices of the 20th century, first had that CBS kind of broadcaster, Edward R. Murrow type of respect, that same sort of dark, Humphrey Bogart, savoir-faire, that Murrow and the whole quality, Walter Cronkite, CBS. Serling had that. Serling had that authority that makes him one of the three coolest guys of the early 60s. Him, John F. Kennedy, and there was something about Serling. He had that sort of Frank Sinatra, that swanky, that sophisticated look, but he had that dark charm of Bond, James Bond. Serling premieres 2 years before Connery debuts as Bond. So in many ways, even though we saw a who's who of Hollywood with The Twilight Zone, there's really only one star, and that's Serling. But in the second season, we start seeing these great introductions to episodes like this with Agnes Moorehead, in which, called The Invaders, written by Richard Matheson, in which she's played by these little Michelin men. What the hell are they to this day? They actually made a little bobbing head, a little doll recently that I just sent away for on eBay. But Agnes Moorehead, in an immortal performance without saying a word of dialogue. Of course, what do we see at the end? We are the little people, it turns out. And when I interviewed the director, Douglas Hayes, who also directed the episode we'll see very soon, I said, Mr. Hayes, she had an almost mimetic performance. She had to mime the episode. He said, Arlen, did you know that Agnes Moorehead studied with Marcel Marceau years before? So whenever you see this episode, if you get the DVDs, which everybody here should own, you will see that Richard Matheson ended up rewriting this episode 10 years later with Karen Black, Trilogy of Terror, TV movie, ABC, 1971, with the Zuni hunting fetish doll. It's basically The Invaders 10 years later. One of my favorite episodes, Room for One More, Honey. The descent into the morgue, what I call one of the suburban nightmares, like getting locked in a department store at night, going down to the morgue in a hospital, only done the Twilight Zone way, where the woman delivering this line, years ahead of her time, is she human? Is she alien? Is she an angel, or is she an angel of death? She's got that Mona Lisa you don't know. Twilight Zone, where do you stand with this woman? Shadow Play in the second season, written by Charles Beaumont. His two great episodes about dreams and reality. The very first opening scene of Vanilla Sky, Cameron Crowe, the writer-director, was so beholden to that episode as an influence. And keep in mind, this episode was based on a Spanish movie only 5 years earlier that was also based on the episode playing in the Jumbotron during that episode is Shadow Play with Dennis Weaver. Now, the second season ends with one of Serling's great episodes, Obsolete Man, which is sort of like the trial by Kafka as might have been rewritten by Ayn Rand. And yet, Orson Welles ends up making a film version of the trial a year after the Twilight Zone episode aired. And the imagery of the giant doors was right out of the Twilight Zone. The stylized sets, these German expressions things, these episodes must have seemed like alien broadcasts compared to what was on television in 1961 in America. Every other show was a television western. Only a Twilight Zone episode looks like this. Here's a behind-the-scenes view of the set. Serling delivered, very rare, an on-air closing narration for this episode in which he says, any state, any entity, any ideology that fails to recognize the worth, the dignity, the rights of man, that state is obsolete. And it was true then, and it was still true today. But the single greatest episode of The Twilight Zone aired a week before Kennedy was elected in 1960, called Eye the Beholder. And that's what we're going to watch right now. The very single, maybe, we'll talk about this later, greatest episode of The Twilight Zone. Ladies and gentlemen, Rod Serling's Eye the Beholder.
You're traveling through another dimension.
At any time, a woman right here just saw it for the first time. If that doesn't burn its way into your brain, David Lynch's film Eraserhead also has this weird, we don't know to this day what this thing was on the bed, but when I saw it, it reminded me of Eye of the Beholder. But yes, that was from Eraserhead and David Lynch's great film. And again, Mulholland Drive was influenced also by the Twilight Zone. You can see that she acted with her hands in the episode, again, almost like a mime would. The compositions during the episode, the chiaroscuro lighting in scenes like this are almost they're like icons of graphic design almost. It was almost like a black and white comic come to life. And in fact, well, once again, when she's finally revealed, who is she? She's Ellie Mae from the Beverly Hillbillies, Donna Douglas. And of course, The Great Mass by William Tuttle. Once again, when they tried to redo The Twilight Zone in the early 90s, they remade this episode, and this is what the faces ended up looking like. Kind of like, I don't know, burn victims to me. It doesn't have what the Twilight Zone had, was the metaphor that rides the line between over the top and timeless and iconic and classic. Not like when they try to redo the Twilight Zone in full color. You can't tell me creatively this holds a candle to that. And maybe that's why Cindy Sherman did one of her paintings also in the mid-'80s. And at the end of this episode, when the leader rants about we must crush out all that is different, like the cancerous growth it is, insert any one of your favorite fundamentalist right-wingers into that character. In fact, right off of the web, I found images like this that use the eye of the beholder to express the kind of political ideals. Now, probably when this episode came out, nobody realized at the time until I did some research and found that EC Comics 7 years earlier had the same exact story called The Ugly One, in which she is revealed to be beautiful and we're on another planet of these sort of amphibious people. And a lot of EC Comics in the 50s were like little Twilight Zone episodes before the Twilight Zone. The 8-page stories that had surprise endings like this echoed later in Twilight Zone. Episodes of the Twilight Zone like this in which you find yourself in an alien prison where you are the animal was in EC Comics in direct episodes, uncredited. Some of them more direct than others. But an image like this also influenced comics that came after the Twilight Zone. The early Marvel comics by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko had Twilight Zone stories in a book called Amazing Adult Fantasy, which is just another way of describing the Twilight Zone. Episodes, just like Twilight Zone episodes, The Last Man on Earth is basically Time Enough at Last. Living statues, mannequins, all taken their Lee and Ditko's regurgitations of Twilight Zone episodes. Now, the artist, Steve Ditko, his art itself was kind of like the Twilight Zone come to life in a weird way. Ditko also pictured the average everyman in all of his intensity, in all of his ugliness, in all of his extremes. And in fact, the last issue of Amazing Adult Fantasy was a Twilight Zone story involving a teenager who gets powers that he uses selfishly. And in the end, he's revealed to be Peter Parker. The success of Spider-Man is basically because it was a Twilight Zone story of a superhero, because that's another way of saying irony. No superhero before Spider-Man had irony as part of his origin, but that's where we got Twilight Zone. Let's take a look at the third season opening. 1961, fall.
You're traveling through another dimension. A dimension not only of sight and sound, but of mind. A journey into a wondrous land whose boundaries are that of imagination. Your next stop, the Twilight Zone.
The spinning vortex, we saw that imagery in Twilight Zone from one of the very first episodes, Perchance to Dream, as he goes through the tunnel of love. Now, the surrealist artist Marcel Duchamp, did a series of things called roto-reliefs that were in surrealist movies like Jean Cocteau's Blood of a Poet. The Twilight Zone kind of resembles that one. Victor Vasarely, a painter, did these kind of pre-op art images. But in fact, the Twilight Zone itself, coming out in 1961, predates Bridget Riley, one of the greatest op art artists, by a full year. She did this in 1962, called Blaze. And you could see the Twilight Zone influence. Yet the Twilight Zone forecasts the Irwin Allen TV show, The Time Tunnel, which used the kind of Twilight Zone vortex as its basis for that show. And we can still see this icon in punk and new wave imagery, the black and white circular things. In the third season of The Twilight Zone, Serling actually sent characters down into a vortex. In the unbelievably surreal existential episode, 5 Characters in Search of an Exit, that both pays allusion to No Exit by Jean-Paul Sartre, one of the founding tracks of existentialism, and also pays homage to Pirandello's play, 6 Characters in Search of an Author. A ballet dancer, a hobo, a clown. They're just called clown. A major general, and a bagpipe player who we don't see. They're in a circular void. They don't know who they are. They don't know how they got there. And then, in true circus style, they climb up the perimeter. And here's a behind-the-scenes view of an episode like this, which has so many metaphors for life on Earth when you are in a situation that seems like a conundrum and you're trapped, or you think you're trapped, and you can't get out, which is a theme of Patrick McGowan's Cult 68 series, The Prisoner, in which people don't really know how they got there, but they find themselves trapped on a beautiful island. They can't get out. And when they try to get out, they are trapped by this circular object. 5 Characters in Search of an Exit were trapped in a circular object. There was a cult French-Canadian film series in the late 90s called The Cube. And people found themselves in this cube-like arena similar to 5 Characters in Search of an Exit. Images like this compared to Twilight Zone. In the third season, in addition to more dolls coming to life, we do have the ultimate ventriloquist nightmare episode. Cliff Robertson, also voicing Willie. Now, the icon of the ventriloquist and dummy goes back to the silent film era. Erich von Stroheim, who directed Dietrich films. The Great Gabbo is like the first time we get this kind of story. 1945, Dead of Night, British film, sequenced in kind of half-hour episodes, had Michael Redgrave, father of Lynn Redgrave and that clan, with the dummy that comes to life. In 1978, young Anthony Hopkins was in Magic. Same story, but none of them can hold a candle to the dummy airing in 1961 because at the end, Cliff Robertson becomes the dummy, and the dummy becomes Cliff Robertson, is one of those endings that's ingrained in your brain forever. One of the great episodes of the third season, Charles Beaumont's Person of Persons Unknown. What if all of a sudden people started telling you, you weren't you? Classic Twilight Zone. Jack Klugman appears in his third episode as a pool shark who has to go up against Fats Brown. Nowadays, you have the comedians that are acting in dramatic roles. Jonathan Winters, who later became, excuse me, a comedy legend. What's interesting about this episode, written by George Clayton Johnson, is that it appeared a couple weeks before the movie The Hustler debuted. Similar story. Who knows which came first and whether Clayton Johnson, because I think The Hustler was a book first. Towards the end of the third season, you have actor Joseph Wiseman as a megalomaniacal man, sort of like a Donald Trump gone totally evil. Well, a year later, where do we see Joseph Wiseman? The first James Bond villain, Dr. No. In fact, the Twilight Zone people, 3 out of the 5 James Bond villains of the 60s. Because Donald Pleasance in 1967's You Only Live Twice, Twilight Zone. 1969's On Her Majesty's Secret Service, Telly Savalas as Blofeld, seen on the Twilight Zone in the classic episode Talkie Tina. Even one of the great episodes of the third season, To Serve Man, in which we find out it's a cookbook. Who is Richard Keel but the 70s James Bond villain Jaws? One of the great episodes of the third season, Little Girl Lost, right through the bedroom wall. That's where this image comes from. How did that get elaborated into Poltergeist by Spielberg and Tobe Hooper 25 years later? That's an example of how the Twilight Zone is like the creative loam for films that have come after. This episode, where a man sells his years to get younger and younger as the episode goes on, until finally becoming a baby, hello, paging Brad Pitt. And that's the logo at the end of the third season. Let's take a look at the fourth and last season opening of The Twilight Zone. Spring 1963. These are the very first images I can recall seeing as a child, 5 years old, in Teaneck, New Jersey, 1963. And this is what I see. These are the first images I can recall.
You unlock this door with the key of imagination. Beyond it is another dimension. A dimension of sound. A dimension of sight. A dimension of mind. You're moving into a land of both shadow and substance, of things and ideas. You've just crossed over into the Twilight Zone.
Of course, the door. We've talked about the door, one of Magritte's many doors, called Victory, 1949. The window, well, Magritte painted The Human Condition, he called this, 1931. Now, maybe one of the most famous surrealist windows was done by Duchamp, called The Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelors even, called by one critic as one of the most deliberately obscure, esoteric paintings of the 20th century. And this original installation in Brussels resembles the Twilight Zone window on the world the most. Of course, we have the eyeball, which then goes to the clock. The clock. When you think of Salvador Dali, you think of those dripping clocks. And this was the Twilight Zone edition. Designed by the fourth season producer, Herbert Hirschman, not a graphic designer. In the bumper graphic, one of my most favorite images of the Twilight Zone, combining the eye and time. This is a Salvador Dali piece of jewelry. The kind of mannequin artist doll, I mean, who knows what that is? But the idea of images in outer space was first seen in the pop culture back the dawn of the comic strip, Winsor McCay, Little Nemo. But the Twilight Zone was the first modern images of characters in outer space. And this artist doll, believe it or not, has a surrealist background. Man Ray had a series of photographs, once again, that he called Mr. Woodman. And they were, again, illustrations for another one of Breton's surrealist manifestos. This image of the doll has been seen in advertising, art, editorially. It's a classic Twilight Zone image. Dolls coming to life in the last scenes of the Twilight Zone. Talkie Tina. I'm Talkie Tina, and I want to kill you. Same voice as Rocky the Bullwinkle. June Foray. 1001 Cartoon Voices was the voice of Talkie Tina, who later was transgendered into the Chucky series. And of course, the actor that Tina eventually kills, in addition to Blofeld, was of course Telly Savalas and Kojak. One of Matheson's favorite episodes of The Twilight Zone was Steel, in which Lee Marvin, in 1963, years before the steely general, has to don robot makeup to step into the ring when boxing's been abolished. And he goes up against a really terrifying looking robot, which was a Terminator ahead of his time in its relentlessness and its black, sharp, dead eyes. And again, the William Tuttle masks in episodes like The Twilight Zone weren't over-the-top special effects that you see today. They're images like this that ride the line. Here's Tuttle himself showing the masks. And one of the great episodes of the last season was called The Masks, directed by Ida Lupino, Once again, Serling, in addition to having many great female actresses, allowed women like Ida Lupino to direct. Another great female-centric episode of the last season. Number 12 Looks Just Like You. Takes place in the future, when you can trade in your ugly body for a beautiful body. Coincidence that the episode aired a year after Marilyn Monroe committed suicide, and the lead character's name is Marilyn, like Norma Ray, thinking that I'm beautiful, aren't I, the way I am? But no. What's interesting about this episode is they cast the supermodel of the day, Susie Parker, here seen in a photo spread in TV Guide, that they actually played as the beautiful women, which was perfect casting, once again, of its time. One of the images from the episode is beautiful. It's like a Maxfield Parrish come to life to get across iconic images of beauty. And the closing narration by Serling, portrait of a young lady in love with herself. Impossible, perhaps, but in an age of bodybuilding and an infinity of cosmetics, let us hesitate to say impossible, which is why this episode is timeless and classic. Twilight Zone practically ends with, again, the first mention of Vietnam. And by 1963, the Twilight Zone gets shortened to Twilight Zone, and it's this, that was the last logo of the series. And the other logos that we've seen are still timeless and classic, but I always return to the original logo that I ended up using for the coffee table art book I did in 1991 called Visions from the Twilight Zone, in which I wanted to treat the black and white television images as art photography, and the dialogue and narration that you heard on the PA coming in tonight as poetry. So that these lines are from one episode and this image is from another. Clocks are made by men. God creates the New York Times. I mean time. And it's to Rod Serling that I dedicate my book and this presentation. When it's his words that open up the book when he says, "The place is here, the time is now, and the journey into the shadows that we're about to watch could be our journey." You're in a kind of limbo. You're neither here nor there. You're in the middle between the two, the real and the shadow. How can you be real? We exist, of course, but how and what way? As we believe, as flesh and blood human beings? How can you be real when you're made of wood? Fictional characters come alive. They come alive so vividly that they make decisions of their own. A playwright may have worked out some kind of move for them, but they refuse to do it. They become so strong that sometimes they take over the whole story. I've been remembering about something I read or heard about a long time ago, about two parallel worlds that exist side by side, and each of us has a counterpart in this world. I'm your memory, your conscience. I'm every one of your aspirations and recollections. I'm also all your failures and defeats. I'm what you call the alter ego. We have two faces, one that we wear and the other that we keep hidden. Just how normal are we? Just who are the people we nod our hellos to as we pass on the street? People, they're the same all over. I'm sure that when God made human beings, He developed them from a fixed formula. As long as they've got minds and hearts, that means they have souls. That makes them people. And people are alike. Is that good, being like everybody? Isn't that the same as being nobody? When everyone is beautiful, no one will be. Because without ugliness, there can be no beauty. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. In this year or 100 years hence, on this planet or wherever there is human life, perhaps out amongst the stars, Earth, it's a race of men struggling for survival. It isn't a place of all beauty. We may yet have wars, and there still remains prejudice. And as long as men walk, there will be angry men, jealous men, unforgiving men. But it has one thing. It lets every man be his own master. Some people aren't built for competition, or big pretentious houses they can't afford, or rich communities they don't feel comfortable in, or country clubs they wear around their neck like a badge of status. Handsome, prosperous, the picture of success. The man who's achieved every man's ambition. Beautiful children, beautiful home, beautiful wife. Idyllic. If you're a success, you're bound to think it's a dream. If not, you think it's a nightmare. Sometimes I'd like to escape away from this turmoil to some simpler existence. I'd been living in a dead rut, and one day I knew I had to come back here. I had to come back and get on a merry-go-round and eat cotton candy and listen to band concerts. I had to stop and breathe and close my eyes and smell and listen. Beautiful, these sort of places where there are no books to keep, where I'm not a little man with no future and no past. We are all travelers. The trip starts in a place called birth and ends in that lonely town called death. Every man is put on earth condemned to die. Time and method of execution unknown. This is the comeuppance awaiting every man when the ledger of his life is opened and examined. Why does a man have to die? The world goes on for millions of years, and how long is a man's life? A handful of years and then an eternity down under the ground. Why does he have to die almost the moment he's been born? Only if a man lived forever could there be any point to living at all. Clocks are made by men. God creates time. And perhaps across his mind there'll flit a little errant wish that a man might not have to become old. And he'll smile then too, because he'll know it is just an errant wish. Some wisp of memory not too important really. Some laughing ghosts that cross a man's mind. An observation as to the psychological nature of man. He's a frightened breed. Being frightened is a normal, natural human function, just like breathing. It's how you react to fright. That's what really counts. I don't want any of the outside world coming in here. It doesn't have to exist if I shut my eyes. If I shut my eyes, it all disappears. If I wish hard enough, I could wish it all away. How thin a line separates that which we assume to be real with that manufactured inside of a mind? The human imagination is often weird. Sometimes it means salvation. The fear has left me now, I'm numb. I have no feeling. It's as if someone had pulled out some kind of plug in me. And everything, emotion, feeling, fear, has drained out. And now I'm a cold shell. I'm conscious of things around me now. The vast night, the stars that look down from the darkness. Up there in the vastness of space and the void that is sky, up there is an enemy known as isolation. As a race, we're unaccustomed to charity. Brutality is a far more universal language to us than an expression of friendship from outer space. I shot an arrow into the air and landed I know not where. Nursery rhyme for the age of space. People are afraid because they subvert every great thing ever discovered, every fine idea ever thought, every marvelous invention ever conceived. They subvert it. They make it crooked and devious. Then too late, far too late, they ask themselves the question, why? By then it's too late. Everything is too late. I remember the earth. I remember it as a place of color. I remember that in the autumn the leaves changed to different colors, red, orange, gold. I remember streams of water that flowed down hillsides, and the water was sparkling and clear. I remember clouds in the sky, white billowy things, floated like ships, like scales, like sails. And I remember night skies like endless black velvet. Night was a quiet time when the earth went to sleep, kind of like a cover that had pulled over itself. It felt like a cool hand just brushed past tired eyes. And there was snow on the winter nights, gossamer stuff, floated down and covered the earth, made it all white and cool. And it was good then. It was right. What is there left that I can believe in? The desert and the wind? The silence? Or myself? I'm a human being. I exist. And if I speak one thought aloud, that thought lives. These men, as long as people talk about you, you're not really dead. As long as they speak your name, you continue. A legend doesn't die just because the man does. These men wrote about life and about the dignity of the human spirit and about love, the strange and wondrous mysticism that is a simple act of living. We believe it to be the greatest weapon against the devil, who is the father of all lies. According to the Bible, God created the heavens and the earth. Somewhere in between heaven, the sky, the earth, lies the Twilight Zone. Thank you. One of the alternate presentations that I do is called The 5 Themes of the Twilight Zone, which is like a mini marathon of 5 episodes, because even though Serling worked with many great writers like Richard Matheson and George Clayton Johnson, all of the writers who worked in the Twilight Zone, their best episodes fell under a set of recurring themes of Serling's that I call the 5 themes, like suburban nightmares, getting locked in a department store at night, science and superstition, like the Agnes Moorehead Invaders episode, the great episodes that dealt with the time element, Serling's maybe major theme, the obsolete man, man alienated by a technological oppressive society. But one of the key aspects of the Twilight Zone was what I call a question of identity, in which Serling, in the very first episode, when he says the place is here, the time is now, and the journey into the shadows that we're about to watch could be our journey, he's basically putting a question to America of its own identity, going from the 50s into the 60s. So when Earl Holliman, as the actor in this episode that you're going to see, goes around saying, I don't know what it is, but I've looked and I haven't seen anybody around. It's like there literally hasn't been a soul. Maybe that is Serling observing America in the 50s, saying it's a soulless generation. And there isn't anybody around. Now, Holloman later on became known more in that Angie Dickinson series, Policewoman? Was that what it was? And the barren landscape that he goes through, the classical American town, was actually the same kind of set, the same exact set, actually, that Jimmy Stewart wanders through in It's a Wonderful Life, which is actually, if you look at that half-hour sequence in which he witnesses life, how it would have happened without him being there, is actually a prototypical Twilight Zone episode. And Capra and Serling were both criticized by critics then and now for sentimental moralizing and soapbox reform through commercial entertainment. But what's great about this episode when you watch it is how it's one of the greatest pilot episodes in TV history, because everything you love about the Twilight Zone is in this episode. All the motifs, man isolated in reality, whether it's everybody who thinks you're crazy, whether it's everybody who doesn't know you, but you know you. The essential situation of alienation from reality. The very first confusion with mannequins was in this episode. And finally, it proves to be not only one man's alienation from reality, but indeed from oneself, which is the key post-war trauma of society, in which we have the bomb over our heads that could destroy life at any second. And that is what Serling keyed in with this episode. So ladies and gentlemen, while I might be a couple minutes off, we can fix this in editing later, but here we are, 50 years later, celebrating the work of Rod Serling, the debut of The Twilight Zone, October 2nd, 1959, the debut pilot episode of The Twilight Zone, Where Is Everybody? And we'll have a Q&A for everybody who wants to hang around afterwards to discuss this episode. Maybe the greatest pilot episode in TV history, the greatest time travel episode that many consider maybe the greatest single episode of The Twilight Zone. The music by Bernard Herrmann. The director of photography, because it was the pilot, was not George Clemens. So Lachelle set the tone for The Twilight Zone. And that is what sold the series, that episode. William Self, who later gave the green light to Batman in 1966, gave the green light to The Twilight Zone. So anybody that wants to, I didn't get to do a Q&A, obviously, after my first presentation before the milk and cookies, but we'll open the floor up to any comments or Q&A or anything. Yes, in the back. Oh, wait, do we want to bring people down to speak to the mic, unless you want to project your voice so everybody can hear?
Curious to see what was production time on these episodes? You were mentioning these time, like they're out in space, and this came out 7 months after. But what was production time on these?
What was what? See, I can't even hear. By the way, I lost 40% of my mid-range hearing from listening to the Walkman. Remember the Walkman pre-iPod? The dozen years I lived in the city, I listened to it on Spinal Tap at 11. So here, years later, 40% of my mid-range hearing, I can hear high notes and low notes, but average conversation.
Welcome, Springfield, then.
There we go. Speak loud and clear.
What I was wondering, you were mentioning that it was 7 months after they went up into space that this episode aired. What is production time on these shows back at that point? Was it 3 months? Was it 6 months? Was it 7 months? How long did it take?
Well, it was a weekly series. I'm not sure. It might have been on a weekly schedule. I mean, it was film television, a half-hour series.
So would they do like an entire season and just keep on popping them out as the week goes on?
I mean, they worked in advance, just like TV works in advance. I mean, you know, in the spring, when the TV season ends, they've filmed those episodes back in December or something. So, however that works.
Okay, that's all I had. Thanks.
Okay.
Sure.
Anybody else? Yes.
Both the scenes in this episode remind you of Edward Hopper?
Of Edward Hopper. You know, in my presentation, I compared it to Giorgio de Chirico because of the barrenness. The Edward Hopper episode, to me, was more like the one I showed Mirror Image, because the automat, I mean, that was Millicent Barnes. But Edward Hopper's figures particularly in those landscapes that he's known for. I was always, as a kid, coming from Twilight Zone, much more into the Twilight Zone aspect of Hopper's figures, who were also kind of, again, they're usually immobile, frozen in position, half delineated and half anonymous, very much like Twilight Zone figures. I should dredge up the papers I used to write in 8th grade when for art class you had to write about an artist. You know, I picked like George Siegel so I could get Twilight Zone in there somehow. Yes?
I may have seen it wrong, but it looked to me like the copyright was 1958.
Yes, because I think they filmed the pilot. It actually aired October 59. I think they filmed the pilot 58, 59, like early 59, late 58. And maybe that's why. And interesting, I was born in 58, so doo-doo-doo, or doo-doo-doo-doo. You know, I make jokes. I say I'm the son Rod Serling never had. My father died when I was 4 months old. I think I got my father figures out of the pop culture that I grew up with, the superheroes, Superman, Serling. You know, they gave me the moral background, the ethical background that you're supposed to get from religion or from your family or whatever. I got it from the pop culture. And, you know, my mother was born in 1921. He had I met his 2 adult daughters last year. I have 2 daughters. I live in Westport. He lived in Westport. I live the life of that Willoughby character. I was just telling, where are they from the Village Voice? Did they leave? I don't know if they're still here. But, you know, I've lived the Twilight Zone life. I'm kind of still living it, believe it or not. Anybody else?
Wasn't there an alternative ending?
What?
For that?
What?
For that episode, wasn't there an original ending where he actually had something brought back in the town?
What my friend Matt is saying is that in the story Serling wrote, or the novelization he wrote after this episode for print, he claimed he had this original ending where when the guy wakes up at the end from the isolation tank, he reaches into his pocket and there's a movie stub because when he went to the movie theater, supposedly got a ticket. Now, when I read that, my feeling is that whoever made the decision to eliminate that and change it to this, I think made the decision for the better. Because again, to me, why it's a great pilot episode is that it was all about the dimension of imagination. The minute you gild the lily by making a physical, like, I was really in the movie theater, that's missing the point why all of the modern remakes of the Twilight Zone get it wrong. Because they think the gimmick is, oh, look, I was really there. You know, the second season, Serling, many of the Twilight Zone writers repeated themselves. The first show of the second season, called King 9 Shall Not Return, with Bob Cummings, is about a guy that finds himself in the middle of the desert, and there's World War II airplanes, and doesn't know how he got there, and blah, 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 blah. The end of the episode, he wakes up, and it was all a delusion, because during World War II, he lost his fighters, his co-pilots, so this was all a delusion. It was just like this episode, except Serling got to have his little ticket stub because after they take him away, they see in his shoes or something, sand in his shoes. Oh, I guess he was really there. You know, that's where you overdo it. What makes the pilot episode brilliant is that it did away with that. It's all about the dimension of imagination, your mind. It's such a great episode. I was just telling my high school art teacher is here. Yes, before I continue, I know I'll blab on.
Obviously, you admire Serling a lot, so I think you can answer this question pretty fairly. What do you think his biggest flaws were as an artist?
Well, I could go on about Serling's flaws. He wrote the best episodes, he wrote the worst episodes. He wrote sentimental episodes that ride the line of sentimentality, like Walking Distance. He wrote the episodes that went over the line. The guy was a workaholic, and out of 156 scripts, he wrote 96 scripts. And, you know, Stephen King made it a point to say in that book, Dance Macabre, he kind of faulted for Serling. Well, you know, my feeling is that, okay, he wrote a bunch of clunkers. He tended to overwrite. His worst episodes have that poetic dialogue, a little purple, a little too much. But you know what? I'll accept his flaws because of the great episodes. See, everybody talks about Serling's sentimentality, but he also wrote the most surreal episodes as well. Mirror Image, this. You know, seeing yourself. I mean, how freaky is that? All of us when we were kids, imagine, what if we met somebody that was exactly like us? Serling was able to take that and write it up. So, yeah, he had his faults. Hello, don't we all? But, I mean, his beautiful writing and his ideas are far going to outlive us. The Twilight Zone forever.
Yeah. You mentioned in the Outer Limits how they were an hour long and they were padded, and then you also mentioned pairing.
Same thing happened to Twilight Zone.
Because of padding, or was there more to those?
For one season, because the ratings were low, if this is what you're getting to, the Twilight Zone changed to an hour format in the hopes it would drive up the ratings. Alfred Hitchcock used to be a half hour, changed to an hour for a brief time. Outer Limits failed after 2 seasons. The hour-long format, which is, by the way, what all standard drama is now. There's no more half-hour, brilliant anthology episodes. Everything is now hour-long dramas. Well, you look at those Outer Limits episodes, you look at the Twilight Zone episodes, I guarantee you if you gave them to professional editors and said, take this and edit it down to a tight half hour, then I would actually make the time to watch the complete Outer Limits. But it's white people sitting around talking. I mean, they're talking and they're talking. By the way, when you leave, sir, make sure you take, did everybody get those comic book promotional? I want to make sure, because if you want to stay in touch with me, and I would love to stay in touch with all of you who came out tonight to help celebrate the Twilight Zone, feel free to email me or keep in touch with me, and make sure, if you didn't get them on their way out by the front desk there, please take a promotional comic card and keep in touch. Yes, Joe.
I have not seen that first episode ever. But what's
How did it hold up, seeing it fresh?
marvelous, but to me, what you already highlighted in terms of serialism, in terms of what Serling was attempting to do, to me, that one scene where he becomes trapped encased in the telephone booth,
Oh, I love that. That was brilliant.
it seems to me that works on many, many levels. The isolation booth, the isolation in the telephone booth, the irony of the telephone supposed to be electronic communication, and it just goes on and on.
You're taking the words out of my mouth. Absolutely, everything this man is saying. This episode, I was telling my high school art teacher, it's a metaphor for life on Earth. We are born alone. We essentially live alone, and we die alone. We are Michael Ferris wheel, the wheel of life. This episode is like a book of the Torah, in the sense of all the wisdom you want about facing life alone. At the end where he says, up there in the vast of space, up there is an enemy known as isolation. What is the human condition in the post-war world that every psychologist and every intellectual has talked about? Alienation is the postmodern syndrome that we all suffer from in some fashion. This episode, as a pilot episode, is basically saying to America that this is man on Earth. It's Adam. It's Adam in the Garden of Eden, Adam outside of the Garden of Eden, left to fend on his own, essentially alone in the world. Forget about the fact that it also was on the cusp of the, NASA space program, like the right stuff that Serling was taking. Once again, great art is of its time, and yet it is also timeless. That episode, it looked like it could have been filmed yesterday. Are you kidding me? He was the everyman in the jumpsuit. He was just an icon for man. Michael, the most common name. I mean, there are chat boards of the Twilight Zone where people go on and on about this episode and the metaphors. The phone booth alone. Haven't we all been in those old-fashioned phone booths where you can't get them open? Serling, like I said, Psycho-Americana. He took a simple thing like making a phone call, and turned it into a beautiful little vignette. that camera move, that's silent, that pans the empty environment. That is Twilight Zone. You are the Latin prefix for essential. There's maybe about 5 episodes that I consider essential Twilight Zone, Twilight Zone. It starts with the pilot episode. After Hours, the woman becoming a mannequin. Mirror image, seeing yourself. 5 characters in search of an exit. If you think Where Is Everybody was a primer for life on Earth, 5 characters is a metaphor for community. What do you do when you're faced with a problem? Generals among us want to go right through it. Others of us stand on the side like the clown and comment. Don't really want to do anything, don't want to take a stand. The ballerina had a creative idea. What do you do with life on Earth? And in the end, they create civilization in that little circular conundrum. The theater of the absurd, Eugene Ionesco. And what did they do? They figured out a way out by joining together. That's a metaphor. That's as dialectic as you want to get. Or didactic. Those to me, and World of Difference, where the guy hears somebody else cut. That to me is your top 5 Twilight Zone episodes as being television surrealist philosophy. And I think on that note, we want to wrap this up. I just want to thank everybody for coming out here. And please, make sure you take a card and feel free. Go to the Paley Center, Paley, WilliamPaley.org. You can read my essay version, which hopefully will be the text for a new book, maybe the time with the DiCaprio movie, if anybody of you know publishers that you want to send my way. And hopefully you'll read that, and that's basically the text of tonight's presentation. And again, please keep in touch with me. Just remind me when you email me, hey, Arlen, saw you, and I would love to just continue this into forever, because the Twilight Zone is forever. Thanks very much.